It was a warm afternoon in the heart of a historic city, a place where centuries-old traditions met the hustle of modern life. Tourists were taking pictures, and locals were going about their daily routines. The sound of footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets, mixing with the chatter of the crowd. Amidst all this, there was one figure who stood motionless, silent, unblinking, and ever watchful. It was the royal guard, dressed in his full ceremonial uniform, standing at attention at his post, just like he had done countless times before. His posture was perfect, his uniform immaculate, his face unreadable. People walking by couldn't help but stare. Some admired his discipline. Others took selfies, but most passed by without giving him a second thought. He was a fixture of the city, part of the daily scene. But to the royal guard, none of that mattered. His job was simple but demanding. Remain focused, unflinching, and perform his duty with honor. At that moment, a man walked by, his steps heavy, his demeanor tense. He was clearly upset, muttering to himself as he approached the guard. The man's eyes were narrow, his jaw clenched tightly. His dog, a large, imposing breed, was tugging at its leash as if it, too, could sense the man's anger. As the man got closer, he threw an insult in the guard's direction, his voice loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. It wasn't just a simple comment. No, the words were harsh, filled with bitterness and prejudice. The guard did not react. His face stayed neutral, his posture straight. The man, now growing more agitated, tried again, this time louder, more aggressive. He raised his voice, his words harsh, trying to provoke the guard into a response. But the guard remained unmoved. His eyes didn't shift, his hands didn't twitch. He was as still as a statue. The onlookers began to take notice, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Some of them looked at the guard, waiting to see if he would break his silence. Would he respond? Would he lash out at the man who was now spewing venomous words his way? But no, he didn't move an inch. The man wasn't backing down, though. He seemed to grow angrier with every moment. His words became louder and more pointed, his face turning red as he aimed his insults directly at the guard. It was clear that the guard's silence was driving him crazy. He had expected the guard to react, maybe even defend himself, but the stillness only seemed to make the man angrier. The more the guard stayed calm, the more furious the man became. The dog, sensing its owner's rising tension, began to growl, its muscles taut, its ears pinned back. The dog barked fiercely, its gaze fixed on the guard, as if it too wanted to take part in the confrontation. The man pulled on the leash, trying to control the dog, but the animal's instincts were taking over. It seemed like the situation was escalating, and everyone around could feel the tension building in the air. The royal guard, still unflinching, stood firm. His mind was focused on his duty, his purpose, and his training. He was well aware that his job was not just about standing still, but about embodying discipline, respect, and strength in the face of provocation. And though the man's insults were growing louder, the guard knew that his silence was his most powerful weapon. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the principle of remaining unshaken, showing strength through calmness. The guard wasn't just standing there. He was making a statement, one that no words could ever truly convey. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm brewing, as the man's frustration continued to build. His earlier insults seemed to have little effect, and his words grew sharper with each passing second. The more the royal guard stood motionless, the more the man felt the need to make him react. He couldn't stand the silence any longer. His pride, his anger. It was all bubbling to the surface, and he wasn't about to back down. He glanced down at his dog, which had been barking and growling fiercely. The dog was large, powerful, and seemed just as angry as its owner. The man's eyes narrowed as he made a decision. His hand gripped the leash tighter, and with a sharp command, he gave the dog a signal to move. "Go," he shouted. The dog, eager and tense, obeyed immediately, charging forward toward the royal guard. The crowd that had gathered around suddenly tensed. People took a step back, some pulling out their phones to capture the scene unfolding. A few gasped, others murmured, unsure of what would happen next. The royal guard, still unshaken, stood in place, but the energy around him seemed to shift. It wasn't every day that a royal guard was faced with such aggression. But the guard was trained for moments like this, trained to remain calm and in control no matter the situation. As the dog closed the distance, barking and snarling, it leaped toward the guard, its teeth bared. The man's anger had now reached its peak. He had thrown everything at the guard, his words, his dog, and still, there was no reaction. It was as if the royal guard was not even there, as if nothing in the world could disturb his calm. For a moment, the crowd held its breath. Some thought the guard would finally show emotion, perhaps lash out at the dog or yell at the man. But instead, the royal guard moved with incredible speed, not in anger, but in a way that demonstrated absolute control. His hand shot out with precision, not to strike the dog, but to stop it midair. The dog's momentum was halted, and the large animal, confused by the sudden interruption, landed back on its feet with a growl, trying to figure out what had just happened. The man stood frozen for a second, as if the entire world had stopped. His dog was now circling him, unsure of how to proceed. His face twisted in confusion, his earlier confidence shattered by the royal guard's unexpected reaction. The guard hadn't attacked the dog. He hadn't even flinched. He had simply stopped the animal from getting any closer, with a calm that seemed almost unnatural in such a charged moment. The man's anger turned to disbelief. What had just happened? How could the guard have stopped his dog so easily? He had expected a fight, a response, some sign of weakness. But all he saw was a steady, unwavering figure, a man who was clearly in control of the situation, even when it seemed out of control. The crowd, too, seemed to exhale collectively, as if relieved. The scene had shifted from one of chaos to one of calm, and it was clear that the royal guard had established his power, not through force or violence, but through his sheer composure. The man, now embarrassed by his failed attempt, looked around. The few onlookers who had been watching the confrontation were staring at him, some with disapproval, others with admiration for the guard. It was becoming clear that the guard's quiet strength was more powerful than anything the man could throw at him. The man stood there, bewildered, as the royal guard didn't move an inch. His dog, still confused by the sudden stop in its charge, started to whimper and pace around in circles. The guard's calm presence had thrown the man off balance, and for the first time, he began to realize that his actions weren't having the effect he had hoped for. For a moment, it seemed as though time had slowed. The crowd, which had been tense just moments earlier, began to murmur softly, unsure of what to make of the situation. The royal guard was unmoved, unwavering, as always, standing tall and focused. His silence and control in the face of such hostility were undeniable. It was as if nothing in the world could shake him. The man, feeling the mix of embarrassment and frustration, glanced around at the growing crowd. The realization hit him. He was no longer the center of attention. All eyes were on him now, not the guard. The man tried to regain some sense of control over the situation, but the more he struggled, the more his earlier anger seemed misplaced. He had expected a reaction, a fight, an argument, something. But instead, he was faced with a figure of discipline and dignity that seemed impossible to provoke. The royal guard, still standing silently, continued to survey the surroundings, his posture as perfect as when the man had first approached him. There was no sign of fear or hesitation, only quiet strength. This wasn't about power or dominance. It was about control. The guard had taken a stand without uttering a single word, demonstrating that action spoke far louder than anything he could say. The man looked at his dog, which was still uncertain, its tail tucked between its legs as if it, too, felt the weight of the situation. The guard had shown the animal that it would not get what it had been sent for, and the dog seemed to sense that it was no longer a threat. The crowd, which had been uncertain about what to expect, was now growing even more respectful of the guard's ability to remain so composed under pressure. The man, his face reddening with frustration, opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. How could he continue with his outburst when the man he was trying to provoke was standing so confidently, so unwaveringly? The royal guard's composure had stripped the man of his ability to escalate the situation further. The realization dawned on him: he had lost. His attempts to insult, to provoke, had failed, and now he was standing in front of someone who had not been moved by his words, not threatened by his actions. The guard's presence alone had disarmed him. The onlookers, too, began to sense the shift. The tension that had hung in the air began to dissipate as the royal guard's silent victory became clear. The power of silence, of calmness, had won the moment. The man, now realizing that his actions had made him look foolish, stood there for a moment longer, his chest heaving in frustration. He was faced with a choice: continue the confrontation and risk further embarrassment, or walk away and save face. The guard had not given him the satisfaction of a reaction, and now the man's options were limited. Slowly, the man began to take a step back, his eyes still glaring at the guard, but without the same intensity as before. The power had shifted from him to the royal guard, and it was clear that the guard had won this silent battle, not through force, but through unwavering discipline and control. The man took a step back, his anger still bubbling just beneath the surface, but something had changed. His earlier confidence had begun to crumble, replaced by a sense of unease. For a moment, he stood still, staring at the royal guard, who remained as calm and focused as ever. The man's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Why hadn't the guard responded to his insults? Why hadn't he given in to the tension in the air, as so many others would have? The dog, which had been pacing anxiously around its owner, now sat down, its earlier aggression fading away. It seemed to sense that its owner had lost control of the situation, and with that, it too began to calm down. The man, still gripping the leash tightly, looked down at the dog, trying to regain his own composure. He muttered a few more words under his breath, trying to salvage his dignity, but the truth was undeniable. He had been outclassed, outmatched, not by force, but by the strength of the royal guard's presence. As he looked around, he noticed the onlookers, many of whom had been watching the confrontation unfold. They had seen the guard's silent strength and unwavering focus, and now their eyes were on the man. Some were shaking their heads. Others exchanged looks of disbelief, as if they had all witnessed something far greater than just a simple encounter. The guard had shown them all what true strength looked like, not the kind that came from anger or violence, but the kind that came from control, from the ability to remain calm in the face of provocation. The man shifted uncomfortably, realizing that he had become the center of attention in a way he never intended. His outburst had not only failed to provoke the guard, but it had also made him appear foolish in front of everyone watching. The royal guard, on the other hand, had not moved a muscle, had not broken his focus. He was a symbol of calm, and in that moment, he had proven that silence could be far more powerful than words. The tension that had once filled the air was now dissipating. The man's chest still heaved with frustration, but it was clear that the situation was no longer in his hands. The royal guard had won, not by physical means, but by maintaining his composure and refusing to engage in the man's anger. It was a victory that spoke volumes, one that didn't require a single punch or raised voice. Finally, the man's gaze shifted downward, his shoulders slumping slightly. He was no longer looking at the guard with the same defiance. Instead, there was a touch of resignation in his eyes. It was as if he had come to terms with the fact that he was not going to win this confrontation. He had tried everything: insults, provocation, even unleashing his dog, but none of it had worked. The royal guard had remained unshaken, unmovable, and that was something the man couldn't quite understand. He had expected a reaction, something that would let him feel in control again. But now, as he stood there, he realized the guard's strength didn't come from fighting back. It came from simply standing tall, unaffected by anything that was thrown his way. The man looked around once more, at the people who had gathered to watch. Many of them were smiling, perhaps out of relief that the situation had been diffused without further conflict. The royal guard, still standing as if nothing had happened, was now more than just a symbol of discipline. He was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in the face of aggression is nothing at all. Slowly, the man began to turn, his steps hesitant at first. The leash in his hand seemed heavier now, the weight of his failure bearing down on him. He had lost the moment, and there was nothing left for him to do but walk away. The guard, without a word, had already won, and as the man retreated, the crowd began to disperse, their eyes still on the royal guard, who remained steadfast, silent, and resolute in his post. The man, now retreating, slowly turned and walked away. His steps were uncertain, weighed down by the embarrassment of his failed confrontation. As he moved further from the scene, the royal guard remained standing at attention, just as he had from the beginning. The moment had passed, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that he had been outclassed in a way he had never experienced before. The crowd, which had been observing the entire encounter, began to disperse, their eyes still occasionally glancing back at the guard. Some people whispered to each other, discussing what they had witnessed. Many of them seemed to admire the guard's composure, the way he had handled the situation without a single word, without any aggression. It was a rare kind of strength, one that left an impression. As the man walked further away, he realized that the attention had shifted. The crowd was no longer focused on him, but on the royal guard. He had, in a way, become the villain of the story, someone who had tried to provoke, to push another person to break. But the guard hadn't budged, and in that silence, the guard had won something far more important than any argument or insult ever could. The man's anger had faded, replaced by a creeping sense of regret. His actions, driven by frustration and arrogance, had led to nothing but failure. He had hoped for a reaction, any kind of response that would validate his outburst, but all he had gotten was silence. Silence that was somehow louder than anything he could have said. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that he hadn't just lost a confrontation. He had lost the respect of everyone around him. He had expected the royal guard to crumble, to shout back, to engage in a verbal battle. Instead, the guard had stood firm, unmoving, and had somehow made the situation feel insignificant. It wasn't just that the guard had been calm. It was the way he had made everything else seem trivial in comparison. The man had wanted to provoke a reaction, but the guard had denied him that satisfaction, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. As he walked away, the man's mind replayed the scene in his head, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't figure out why the guard had been so unaffected. Had the royal guard known that engaging with him would only escalate things, or had he simply realized that there was no need to respond to someone so clearly in the wrong? Whatever the reason, the man couldn't help but feel like he had been defeated by a force much stronger than just a person standing still. By the time the man had disappeared from view, the crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few stragglers remained, still in awe of the guard's ability to maintain such composure. The onlookers were clearly impressed. Some muttered about how rare it was to see someone handle a situation like that with such calm strength. The royal guard, meanwhile, had not once shifted his gaze. He continued to stand, as still and as stoic as ever. The guard's actions had said everything. He had not needed to speak or engage in any way that would have played into the man's expectations, and that perhaps was the greatest form of strength. In that moment, the guard had shown everyone that true power was not about reacting to every provocation, but about knowing when not to react at all. His silence had been far louder than any words or insults could have been, and the people who had witnessed the scene knew it. The moment had left them all with something to think about. The quiet, unwavering strength of someone who knew their worth and would not be swayed by the noise of the world. As the royal guard remained at his post, unmoved and unwavering, the energy around the scene seemed to shift. The tension that had once filled the air had dissolved, replaced by an almost serene calm. The onlookers, who had been uncertain just moments ago, now exchanged glances, their thoughts clearly altered by what they had just witnessed. There was an unspoken admiration in the way they looked at the guard. Some whispered among themselves, impressed by the strength of his silence, while others were simply in awe of how effortlessly he had maintained control of the situation. But despite the crowd's growing sense of respect for the guard's composure, there was still one person who had yet to grasp the full weight of the moment. The man who had tried so desperately to provoke the guard. He had retreated into the distance, his pace slower now, but his mind was racing. He was still trying to make sense of everything. He had come into the scene with an intention to ruffle feathers, to upset the quiet order around him. But the royal guard had not allowed that. It wasn't just that the guard hadn't reacted the way he had expected. It was that his entire plan had crumbled in the face of someone who understood that certain things, certain people, weren't worth engaging with. As the man walked, his frustration began to give way to a different emotion: self-doubt. He had wanted a fight, but what he had gotten was a lesson in composure. He had thrown insults, provoked with every step, but it hadn't worked. The guard had stood firm, his discipline and focus remaining unshaken. And now, walking away from the scene, the man felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had been the one to escalate things, yet it was the royal guard who had walked away with the upper hand. For the man, the realization hit hard. His earlier sense of superiority, of confidence in his ability to control the situation, had evaporated. The royal guard hadn't needed to say a word. He hadn't even needed to make a move. His silence had done everything for him. The guard had shown that true strength wasn't always in reacting, in meeting aggression with aggression, but in knowing when to remain calm, when to stand firm, and when to simply let the world around you unfold without adding fuel to the fire. In the distance, the crowd continued to discuss what they had witnessed. A few people shook their heads, still processing the surreal nature of the encounter. It had been so unexpected, so different from anything they had imagined. They had all thought that a confrontation was inevitable, but the guard had defied their expectations, leaving them with a deeper understanding of discipline and control. Among the remaining onlookers, a few shared their thoughts on how remarkable it was that the royal guard had handled the situation so effortlessly. Some expressed how they had admired his restraint, while others acknowledged how important it was to not give in to provocation, no matter the circumstances. The guard's quiet strength had become a lesson for everyone present, one that would stick with them long after the moment had passed. As the last of the crowd dispersed, the royal guard remained at his post, standing tall and vigilant, as if the encounter had never happened. His calmness, his discipline, was a part of him now, a reflection of his purpose. And as he continued to stand there, a small sense of pride grew in the hearts of those who had witnessed the moment. They had seen what true strength looked like, not in words or in reactions, but in the quiet, unwavering presence of someone who knew their role and stood firm in it. The royal guard had shown them all that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. As the scene began to settle, the last traces of tension faded away, leaving only a quiet stillness behind. The crowd, which had once gathered in anticipation of an explosive confrontation, now dispersed, their voices softer, their steps more deliberate. Some people continued to walk past, glancing back at the royal guard, who remained steadfast and unmoving at his post. There was a newfound respect in their eyes, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. The day had continued on as normal, but something had changed. People had seen something rare and powerful, the strength of composure, of calmness in the face of conflict. As for the man who had tried to provoke the royal guard, he was long gone, disappearing into the distance. His steps were slow, and his head hung a little lower than before. The anger that had fueled his actions had gradually faded, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. His plan had not only failed, but he had made a fool of himself in front of everyone. The thought that the royal guard had remained so unfazed by his insults, so unbothered by his outbursts, was a blow to his ego. He had expected some sort of reaction, anything to justify his anger. But all he had gotten was silence, and in that silence, the guard had won. With every step, the man's frustration and embarrassment grew. He had expected the guard to engage, to rise to the challenge he had set. But the guard had proven that not every challenge needed a response. And now, the man was left to walk away with nothing to show for his efforts. It wasn't just that he had failed to provoke the guard. It was that the royal guard had not allowed him to achieve anything at all. The more the man thought about it, the more he realized that his actions had been misguided. The guard had handled the situation with a quiet dignity that the man couldn't begin to understand. The more he reflected, the more he saw that he had been the one to lose. And it wasn't just in the eyes of the crowd. It was in his own eyes too. The royal guard, on the other hand, had long since returned to his unyielding position. He stood as he had before, his back straight, his gaze forward. The crowd was gone, and the street was once again filled with the regular hum of life. People chatting, passing by, going about their business. But there was something different in the air now. The guard's presence had made an impact, not through force or words, but simply by remaining steadfast. His silence had spoken volumes, and those who had witnessed it would carry that lesson with them. The scene had been brief, yet it had been powerful. It had shown that true strength didn't always need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was in the quiet moments, in the ability to remain unshaken, no matter what was thrown your way. The royal guard had proven that in spades. While the man had tried to stir trouble and chaos, the guard had simply stood his ground and let the situation unfold as it would. His quiet power had shone through, not because he had reacted, but because he hadn't. As the day wore on and the streets began to empty, the memory of what had happened lingered. It was a lesson in how to carry yourself in difficult situations, how not to be moved by the actions of others. The royal guard's unwavering calm had left a mark on those who had seen it. For some, it would be a reminder of the power of composure. For others, a lesson in humility and the importance of controlling one's emotions. But for everyone, it had been a demonstration of quiet strength, something that would stay with them long after they left the scene. The royal guard continued to stand, a silent sentinel in the heart of the city, as life around him went on. He had done his duty, not just by protecting his post, but by showing what true strength looked like in the face of hostility. And as the crowd faded into the distance, they carried with them a newfound understanding of what it meant to remain unshaken, no matter the provocation. As the hours passed and the streets began to settle into the quiet of evening, the royal guard stood motionless at his post, as if nothing had ever happened. The world around him continued to move, people coming and going, the steady flow of life resuming its rhythm. But the memory of the earlier incident lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. For some, it had been a fleeting moment, a brief, intense interaction that would soon fade into the background of their daily lives. But for others, it had been something more profound, a reminder of the power of self-control and the strength found in remaining unshaken, no matter the circumstances. The royal guard had given them something to think about. The quiet power of composure, the dignity that comes from not reacting to every provocation. As for the man who had tried to provoke the guard, he had long since disappeared from view. His steps had taken him far from the scene, but his mind was still occupied with the events of the day. The initial anger that had fueled his actions had turned into something far less certain. He had been angry, frustrated, and wanted to make someone else feel the same way. But in trying to provoke the royal guard, he had found himself facing a response that he hadn't anticipated. A response that didn't come in the form of anger or aggression, but in complete silence and calm. The man had expected a confrontation, some form of validation for his feelings. But instead, he had been met with strength in the form of silence. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just that the guard hadn't reacted. It was that the guard had taken control of the situation in a way that the man couldn't have imagined. The royal guard had shown him, without saying a word, that sometimes the best way to handle provocation was not to engage with it at all. In the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed through the street as more people walked by. Some glanced at the royal guard, perhaps wondering if something had occurred earlier. Others went about their business, unaware of what had happened just a short time before. But for those who had witnessed the encounter, the guard's presence had made a lasting impression. They had seen what true strength looked like, not the kind that came from fighting back, but the kind that came from standing firm, unmoving, no matter the circumstances. The crowd had long since dissipated, but the lessons they had learned from the encounter remained with them. The royal guard had demonstrated that calmness and control were just as powerful as any force. By not reacting to the man's anger and insults, the guard had shown that it wasn't always necessary to engage with hostility. In fact, sometimes the best response was no response at all. As the sun began to set, the city's energy shifted from the bustle of the afternoon to the quiet hum of the evening. The royal guard stood tall, still unmoving, his duty not just to protect his post, but to embody the strength of discipline and patience. His calm presence seemed to anchor the entire scene, a constant reminder that strength wasn't always about physical power. It was about resilience, dignity, and the ability to stay true to one's purpose in the face of adversity. The man who had provoked him might have learned a valuable lesson, but so too had the crowd that had gathered. They had witnessed firsthand that true strength wasn't about how loud or forceful you could be. It was about the grace of standing firm, the quiet power of not letting anything shake your sense of self. And as the last of the onlookers faded into the streets, the royal guard remained at his post, still embodying that lesson for all to see. His presence had made a statement without needing to say a word. And in doing so, he had shown everyone around him the power of silence and the strength it took to remain calm in the face of provocation.